Good evening. Welcome. I appreciate your being here. Tonight we're going to talk a bit about taxes in retirement and why you need to be in a 0% tax bracket. Like we said here in our subtitle, 0% or bust. And by bust, I honestly mean you will be bust. You will be broke. Let's get into it. Quick disclaimer up front here. This is just an educational presentation. I am not selling anything. I do offer at the end to be able to go over your situation with you if you'd like, but that is done for free. So I'm not actually selling anything. This is just a concept. Quite honestly as well, before doing anything with this concept, you need to be sure that you're doing it correctly. I would strongly advise that you work with someone who is a competent, trained professional. What's the impact? Honestly, the ideas I'm about to present will make all the difference for your retirement. You really, really, really need to take whatever preconceived notions that you have and set them aside for the next 30, 40 minutes to be able to just see what is actually being taught and open your mind to the idea of, well, maybe that could or maybe that couldn't make a difference to what I'm already doing. Picture the cup there, a teacup that's already full, can't accept anything new. Old Zen concept. I want to start out talking about just something that we've probably all experienced at some point in our lives, but especially young children. I know my kids got into, at times, saving towards wanting to buy something that really mattered to them. In most cases, it was a toy. Might not have been as important to me, but it meant the world to them. And so they would work, we'd have them do chores around the house, and they would save their money and they would count it and they would sacrifice. They would do things they normally weren't willing to do. And they would eventually get to the point where they had everything they needed to be able to make that purchase. And they felt so much accomplishment. And I don't know about any of you. I know when I was a kid, I got to that point where I was ready to make a purchase, got up to the counter and found out that there was this concept I'd never heard of before called taxes. And quite honestly, everything that I had saved, once you subtracted taxes, was not enough. And I ended up having to save more. Hopefully you see where I'm going with this. It's pretty obvious from the title of our presentation. But the same thing is happening time and time again to people in retirement where they have worked hard, they have saved, they have done things that they normally wouldn't do based on the idea that at some point later on in life, they'd be able to do things that they weren't currently doing, only to find that taxes were a different number than what they had planned on those taxes being. And we'll get into all sorts of ramifications from that in just a few minutes here, but it's the same story. No matter how much they've saved, if taxes are not what they had planned for, if taxes are more than they had planned for, most couples find retirement to be harder than they had planned on it being. What's the difference in these scenarios? Well, first off, the little boy didn't really know about taxes, but as adults, we do. We know taxes are coming when we're in retirement, and we still make moves that don't prepare us for them. The other difference is also kind of sad. The child can go home and spend a little more time earning a little more money. But that's the last thing we want to do in retirement. We don't want to have to go back and get a job. We don't want to have to give up things that we had planned on. Not saying that we have to live lavish lives for retirement to be fulfilling, but if there are things that you're meant to do in this life and you can't do them because you can't afford it, that's a shame. Especially if it was preventable by just changing the strategy that you used to plan for your retirement, that you used to plan for fulfilling your mission, your purpose. So I say that because I take this very seriously. I hope that some of it jives with you in a way that helps you reconsider things a little bit. So let's get into it. What do we know about taxes, especially in retirement, and what should we do about it? The first, they'll go up. And I say that as though it's an absolute surety. Ask yourself, do you believe taxes are going up, going down, or staying level? And you could go out and do a Family Feud style survey on the street, and I think you would get 100 answers out of 100 that said that they think that taxes will go up before they retire. I have yet to hear anyone say they think taxes will go down. And the math behind that, the reason that that is such a surety, Social Security was not set up to carry the burden that it's carrying today. Medicare was also not set up to carry the burden that it's carrying today. When we look at the number of baby boomers that are currently retiring and starting to claim Social Security, it's an astronomical number, and it's a system that wasn't designed that way. When Social Security was first introduced as part of the New Deal, there were 42 workers for every person who was on Social Security. There were a large number of people putting money into the system and a very small number relatively taking money out. We also saw that people lived a much shorter lifespan. They would work until 62, 65. They'd work until their mid-60s. Well, the life expectancy at the time was 62, and you couldn't get into Social Security until 65. Very few people actually got into the system, and those that didn't live much longer once they were on Social Security. We find today that there are people, because of medical advances, who are living well into their 80s, 90s, even the hundreds. They're living on Social Security for a much longer time than the system was designed for, and they are doing it in a strange bubble where especially those baby boomers have grown the number of people on Social Security to be disproportionate to the number of people paying into the system. Like I said earlier, it used to be 42 people were working for every one that was on Social Security. We're now down in about the 8 range, and the number is changing over the next decade to the point where we'll be in the 2 or the 3 range. 2 or 3 people working for everyone that's on Social Security. That creates a huge burden. David Walker was the Comptroller General of the United States during both the Clinton and Bush eras. And I'll just read his quote here off the screen. There's simply no other way to handle our ever-mounting debt burdens except by doubling taxes over time. Otherwise, our growing commitments for Medicare and Social Security benefits will gradually squeeze out spending on other vital programs. There are other places where he said very similar, where he doesn't just talk about spending on other vital programs. He says that we'll collapse. He says that there will be no spending. So what should we do about it? We can't necessarily change Social Security individually. We can't necessarily change the number of people who are getting on that, but we can minimize or eliminate our taxes in retirement. Minimizing them, dangerous. And honestly, it's what a lot of people do. A lot of CPAs, a lot of professional financial advisors work on getting you into lower tax brackets. But if you take into account what David Walker is saying here, even in the lowest tax brackets, if they have to double over time, suddenly those lowest brackets are not nearly as low as they seemed. Really, 0 taxes in retirement is the only safe spot. Another thing we know about taxes, when we're in retirement, we are not going to have the same deductions that we have right now. This is one a lot of people don't consider. You'll probably have paid off your home, your kids will have left, you're not making contributions to a tax deductible retirement plan anymore. You won't have the same deductions. So what should we do about that? We want to do the same thing. We want to minimize or eliminate taxes. And the same story, minimizing them is dangerous. 0 is the only safe spot for you. They'll be due in retirement. Another thing we know about taxes. And what I mean by that is the majority of our financial planning today is in what we call deferred plans. Plans where we take a tax benefit today to then pay taxes later on. We're taking a small amount of money that we hope to grow to be significantly larger later on, and we're saying, I'll take the tax break that's available today while it's a small amount of money. I'll have that money grow over time, and then later, when I'm also thinking that tax rates will be higher and deductions that would have shielded me against those taxes will probably be gone, I'll pay taxes at that point. It's a triple whammy. It's such a dangerous position to be in. And most of us, the majority of our planning is based on deferred plans. And you can see the problem there. We will end up in a spot where we're paying a higher tax rate on a larger amount of money. it's going to hit us harder than we think it's going to. So what do we do about it? We minimize or eliminate taxes, mainly by moving into non-taxable vehicles today. And that can have some costs to it. That can have some effects. We'll get into those in just a few minutes here. But the cost of taking care of something now while tax rates are lower, while the nest egg is still smaller, and while we have some deductions to shield us against the effects of those taxes, it's always going to be a better setup that way. And those vehicles that we want to move into, Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, and then cash flow insurance vehicles. The other thing we know about taxes is that most of what we've been talking about, the way people have their plans structured currently, will be counted as what is known as provisional income. And that will, that will trigger the taxation of your Social Security income. Social Security, if you stay under certain really low thresholds, will not be taxed. But if you go over those thresholds, either 50% or 85% of your Social Security will be counted towards your taxable income. And that can have a huge impact on those, especially those who don't have a lush retirement plan, who haven't really had the chance to grow things the way they want to. If you're depending on Social Security and up to 85% of it is subject to taxes and tax rates have gone up significantly, it can have a huge impact. And it's just not a surprise people should want to have. There are ways of not being surprised, okay? And that ultimately comes down to minimizing or eliminating provisional income, which is done by using some of these other sources that we're going to talk about. Do we see the problem here? It's huge. I haven't got tons of time in our presentation today to really get into the math, but I hope you can at least feel, based off of what we talked about, how important it is to really consider getting into a 0% tax bracket in your retirement years. All right, what it all comes down to. Most planning looks at whether you are in your earning years or your growing years or your spending years. And those are three important phases. We're not really going to get into those here, but what we want to talk about is the idea that there are three separate buckets that money should be put into: a taxable bucket, a tax-deferred bucket, and a non-taxable bucket. And if I'm saying that we want to have a plan that is zero tax in retirement, there's probably already a question in your mind as to why would we then want to have a taxable or even a tax-deferred bucket. We'll get into those strategies. We cover some key points right here, but we'll get into them in more detail as we go along. But your taxable bucket, this is very common for people to have. It can be savings accounts, mutual funds, bonds, all sorts of vehicles that are not qualified plans. They are not in any way tax advantaged. You put money in, the money grows, and you end up paying taxes on that growth. Why do we say to have some money here? Because in most cases, qualified plans, those that have tax advantages, come with some stipulations, and you can't always access the money when you need it. As a financial professional, I've always told people it is super important to retain flexibility and freedom, because no matter how much we plan, life is going to throw things at us. And if you don't have access to what you need when you need it, then what was the planning for? Like it says here, this really is just what we want to use for our emergency fund. It needs to be liquid. It needs to be that you can access the money today, so long as financial institutions are open. If it's a banking holiday, you might have to wait till tomorrow, but you sign a paper, you get your money. You swipe a card, you get your money. And like it says here, we only want it to be about 6 months of income here. There are taxable effects to this, but by keeping it to 6 months of income, you're not putting enough into anything that is going to cause the rest of your plan to fall apart. And we can maintain a 0% tax fairly easily with this. When we get into the tax-deferred bucket, 401k is far and wide the largest savings vehicle that people are putting money into for retirement. And it's what I explained earlier. It's where you put money in, you get a tax break today, it comes out of your check before they even calculate the taxes. And then later on, when you access the money, you're going to have to pay. Like I also talked about in the taxable bucket, this does come with some stipulations. You can't access your money without a penalty before age 59 and a half, except for very unique scenarios. An IRA or individual retirement account is really just a version of a 401k meant for one person rather than for a group of employees who are part of a company. A lot of people have IRAs mainly because they had a 401k, then they left a company and they had to put that money somewhere that was still a qualified vehicle, or they would have had to pay taxes and penalties on having taken the money out. So IRAs follow pretty much the exact same rules as 401ks. You get the tax benefit today, you're going to pay taxes later on. And then there are other kinds of plans out there, Simples, Kios, and so on, that are meant mainly for people who own their own businesses, but are very, very similar as well. All of these have contribution limits on them, and that can be a huge hindrance. If you need more in retirement than what you can reasonably contribute and expect to grow before retirement because of contribution limits, you're probably not going to get where you need to be. They will be taxed on distribution. Some people get to the point in retirement where they think, well, I will just save these dollars, maybe pass them on to my kids. They actually have stipulations in them that say that you have to start distributing money by age 70 and a half, and it's calculated on a formula that looks at your age and the value of the account to try and actually drain things before you're likely to pass away. Those forced distributions, or what we call RMDs, required minimum distributions, can be a huge snafu if you're trying to be in a 0% tax bracket, because all of a sudden when you only want to have X amount of actual taxable income coming out in a year, you're required to take an additional amount because you suddenly hit age 70 and a half. It can have a huge impact. Very dangerous. Not that we don't want to have them. We just want to have the right amount there. And most people, because this is the workhorse of their retirement plan, have too much there already. Really, we only want to contribute enough to receive whatever your employer is matching, because free money is free money. We want to take advantage of that. Non-taxable vehicles, Roth 401k, Roth IRA, those are both very similar to 401ks and IRAs, with the one twist that they are flipped upside down. Instead of getting a tax benefit when you contribute the money, you don't pay taxes when you distribute the money. So you put the money in today, don't get any kind of tax benefit, but then you go through what we talked about earlier. That money grows. You now have a larger amount that would be taxable if you were in a traditional plan, but because you're in a Roth, it's not going to be taxed when you pull that money out. The other vehicle listed here is a cash flow insurance policy, and we will have a larger section towards the end on that. But there are some very unique features in cash flow insurance policies that allow you to grow money without contribution limits being in the way. There are some guidelines of how much insurance you have to buy to be allowed to put money in and not have it be counted as just an investment, but actually still count as an insurance policy. But it is the sort of thing that if managed correctly, and that's the key, is it's really easy to not manage them correctly, but if managed correctly, grows money in a significant way and then puts you in a spot where you can access those funds tax-free later on. So it says here that both of these vehicles are not taxed on distribution if done correctly. The real key then is figuring out how to convert traditional plans to Roths and then put the rest into the proper insurance vehicles. I wish we were in a classroom. I feel like I need to say, any questions, feel free to put your hand up. Let's look at taxable versus non-taxable for a minute here. Let's say in retirement you need $100,000 a year to live on. So that needs to be what you have available to spend after all the taxes have come out. Okay. And some of you are saying 100,000 sounds so exorbitant. Others are saying 100,000 isn't nearly going to be enough. We all have our own individual budgets and lifestyles. Honestly, especially when we consider the health problems that tend to come with living into our 80s and 90s, 100,000 is honestly a fairly lowball number for a large number of Americans today. But let's say you had $1 million nest egg. How much do you need to withdraw from that if it's in a taxable vehicle? And we're going to presume that you're in a 24% federal and a 6% state tax or a 30% bracket total. Most people, if I ask them this, if you have $1 million nest egg, you want $100,000, how much do you need to withdraw from that nest egg to net 100,000? So you're going to have to pull out more than the 100,000 and then pay the taxes. How much does that need to be? Well, quite frankly, most people look at that and they will say $130,000 because you take the 100, you tack on the 30%. But the problem with that math is if you took out 130 and then you paid 30% taxes on it, you still end up with a $91,000 amount in your pocket because 30% taxes on 130,000 is actually 39,000. You're still 9,000 short of where you needed to be. You could possibly budget, scrimp, and save, but it just doesn't work that way. Okay, ultimately, the real answer, the number you would need, is $142,857.14. That's almost $150,000. That's almost 50% more than the 100 that you need. And I got that just by taking the 100,000 and dividing it by 70%. So let's take a look then. The math should be pretty obvious, but when we look at the same scenario in a non-taxable situation, you have the $1 million nest egg. How much do you need to withdraw to end up with $100,000? Well, if there's no tax being calculated, the answer is simply $100,000. That's the beauty. And let's look at some math here. We are going to presume that your nest egg in each scenario has stopped growing. Obviously, we don't want that to be the case. We want to keep growing your money ad infinitum. We want that to go on forever. But let's just, for simple math, say we no longer have any growth. So on the left, we have taxable, where we have $1 million nest egg, but because of that 30% tax, we're going to have to pull out $145,857 each year. At the end of the first year, you're left with $854,000. You pull out again the next year, you're left with $708,000. And in a period of 7 years, you get to the point where you don't have enough money anymore in the account to even pull out what you need. Now, in the non-taxable scenario, obviously our account, because there's no growth here, is depleting as well. But instead of 7 years, it depletes over a period of 10. And that's significant. If we were to carry the other account on, obviously you can't make negative withdrawals, but you're short $312,000. I hope you see the power of this. Being in a non-taxable position in retirement makes all the difference. If we had a lot more time in our presentation today, I would spend a moment or three going over the math of, well, let's factor growth in here as well. At the end, I'm going to show you where you can see some of those numbers for yourself anyways. But it's significant. Once you factor growth in, the difference between these two is even bigger still, because on the one nest egg, you are getting no tax, which means you have a larger amount collecting interest over time as well. So it just ends up being logarithmic how much you lose in a taxable situation. Okay. If that's the case, if the difference between those two is so stark, why do we want to have a tax deferred bucket? Why not just put everything into the tax-free vehicles? Two good reasons. We've kind of hit on some of this already. First, you want to be able to get the free money that your employer is giving. And then second, you want to be able to make use of the standard deduction. In retirement, we said you probably have lost all of your itemizable deductions. That doesn't mean you won't have a deduction. It just means you'll have to settle for whatever the standard deduction ends up being in the years that you're in retirement. And if there is a standard deduction there, it gives us the wiggle room to be able to have some taxable income. If the standard deduction like this year is at $24,000 for a married couple, you can have up to $24,000 come out of taxable vehicles and not have it create a problem for you. You will still pay zero taxes. It gives us that wiggle room that we need to be able to accept the employer match and still be in a 0% tax bracket in retirement. So we still want some money in that tax deferred bucket. But once we've fully funded the first two buckets, once we've gotten to the point where we can do the math and see that in retirement there's enough in the taxable emergency fund and the tax deferred bucket that when there's a little bit of growth in there and we start pulling money, we're going to have to pull out X amount before 70 and a half to keep it so that the required minimum distributions don't push us over the standard deduction for the year. Then everything else should go into our tax-free bucket. I know that was a huge, really verbose sentence, that there were all sorts of concepts in there, but ultimately you want to see that the lion's share of what you're doing for retirement is in the tax-free bucket. And like I said earlier, you want to have a professional who understands all of the different cogs that are moving here, be the one to sit down and map this out with you so that you put the right amounts in the right places. But the real question on this slide is, what if we have too much in either of the first two buckets? How do we get money from the taxable or tax deferred over into the tax-free bucket? Couple different things we can do. One would be Roth conversions. The IRS allows you to take take your tax deferred accounts and convert them over into Roth accounts. In most cases, you don't want to do it all in one fell swoop, because the money that you pull out of a tax deferred account to put into a Roth account will count as part of your taxable income for that year. So you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way where you're not creating a large tax event for yourself up front. Ultimately, we really want to make use of years where you already have high deductions to be able to offset the taxes. If you have a year where for some reason you have really high deductions, you can pull more out of your traditional accounts and use those deductions to offset them. And really, net effect is that you're not creating more taxes for yourself. Other thing we want to do is try and take care of all of this while taxes are unusually low. The current tax brackets, in 2017, there was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed that put us into some unique tax brackets that are historically low. Generally, there are some unique things. They changed the number of brackets. They changed the banding or the width of those brackets. And again, you want a professional to help walk you through all of this. But these brackets put us into a spot, and we know until 2026 that they're locked in, where we have some predictability. Instead of trying to figure out, can I do this? Can I not? Would it be better to do it later? Before this Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed, we really were in a spot where we had to question, we know taxes have to go up. When are they going to do it? And so people felt like they needed to do everything today and would sometimes bite a bigger current tax bullet to create a Roth conversion than they maybe needed to. Now that we know that we have until 2026 with some fairly favorable tax brackets, it puts us in a spot where we can map out how to do things over time, have it done before retirement, but create as minimal taxation as possible. So let's just look at the brackets here for a second. Like I said, there are more brackets than there used to be. And these brackets, there's not time enough here to be able to go into all of it, but I'm going to just say that there is a sweet spot in here. If you find yourself in the 22% bracket in retirement, we said you needed about 100,000 of income. This puts you at 77 or more. You're in a spot where you're paying 22%, but the next bracket starts at 165 and it's only a 2% difference. If you can take the difference between 77 and 165 and remove that, that's about $90,000 from your not as favorable traditional qualified accounts and roll that into Roth accounts, the tax difference isn't going to be super crazy. And then you have between 165,000 and 315,000 before you jump up. And the next jump is significant. No one wants to be in that 32% bracket if they can help it. But if you have significant amounts in qualified retirement plans and they are traditional, you're going to be taxed later on, you have such a margin here that you can play with between the 22 and the 24% bracket. Again, you want to sit down with a professional, but it gives a lot of leeway to be 2% difference on your taxes to move tons of money while you still have deductions to play with, as opposed to possibly later on doing it when you don't know what the tax brackets will be, except that you know they'll be higher. There's just a sweet spot in here and a window up until 2026 to really be able to get some good work done. A quick thought on this: if this is of interest to you, if you have significant money sitting in traditional qualified accounts, because we only want to do so much per year so that we don't create taxable events, we're in mid-November right now. These kind of conversions have to be done before the end of the calendar year to be able to be counted for that tax year. So if you're in a spot where you think you have enough that it's going to take several years to get it out, you may want to make some moves before the end of the year. You may want to talk to someone who gets how to do this. Another option is a 72T. 72T is a provision from the IRS that says if you are willing to take substantially equal periodic payments from your traditional qualified plans, your 401k or your IRA, you can do so before the age of 59 and a half without having to worry about a 10% penalty. Normally, because they say this is for retirement, if you try to touch it before 59 and a half, they automatically slap that 10% penalty on, and they will also add that to your income for the year and you'll be charged taxes. There are a couple caveats here. You have to do it for at least 5 years or until you're 59 and a half, and they say you have to keep doing it for whichever is longer. So there's a formula that looks at how much do you have in the account, how old are you, this is how much you can or should take out per year, and they factor in the projected growth and so on. That's why they say substantially equal, because growth can affect whether or not these yearly payments are exactly the same or not. But the idea is either 5 years if that carries you past 59 and a half, or more than 5 years if you're young enough that you're not going to be 59 and a half within the next 5 years. But you take those periodic payments, you still do pay taxes, but again, if we can map things out so that you are in that sweet spot on the tax brackets under the current tax plan, it still can be a very viable way of transitioning from your taxable and tax deferred buckets over to the non-taxable bucket. I said taxable and tax deferred. Obviously, qualified plans would only be the tax deferred. So why would you use either method? If you have to pay taxes now or tax later, I hope from everything that's been said so far, this is already super obvious. It can be a bit of a pain to map things out and do the math and sit down with a professional and try and wrap your head around all of this. But if you're going to be taxed now or taxed later, the real question is, are the taxes today going to be bigger or smaller than the taxes later? Or another way of looking at it, what will your net cash flow be? If you pay some tax today and have a little bit less to invest but have time for it to grow, or you pay taxes later on when the rates have gone up, the deductions have disappeared, and you have more money to be taxed, the math always bears out that it makes more sense to bite that bullet, take care of things today. So, what we just said, all of these points, you end up with greater income in the end, period. So what next? Once you've put all you can into the Roth vehicles, you've capped out your yearly contributions, what do we do? It comes down to cash flow insurance. And this is a concept that some people call it life insurance retirement plans, or LIRPs. Some call it max funded insurance. I don't like the sound of having a LRPI retirement. I just call it cash flow insurance because our goal is to create cash flow for you. Um, honestly, of all the things we've talked about today, this is by far one of the least understood concepts out there, even amongst insurance agents. There are agents who understand that you can grow cash flow in a policy, but they don't understand how to do it correctly. It's often frowned upon by popular financial gurus on the radio. And in most cases, it's because they're working with a different concept or strategy. In most cases, they're working to help people get out of debt and get control of their finances rather than build retirement wealth. Or they're working towards building retirement wealth in vehicles that are simple enough that you don't have to get other professionals super involved. This does have to be structured correctly to work. I highly recommend not trying to do this on your own, or it can easily blow up on you. Advantages of cash flow insurance. First off, there's a death benefit, and there are time in other moments, other conversations to really discuss why that's important. But to be able to know that your family will receive something upon your death changes how you live your life. From there, this allows for tax-free growth of your money and tax-free use of your money later on. You can even use it as your own bank, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And it can also be used if you end up needing long-term care. But it all comes down to proper structuring. You have to overfund the policy. You can't just pay the minimum fees. If you do, it won't grow. The money will get eaten up by the fees. You have to put in as much cash as possible. And there are guidelines set by the IRS, by the government, that say you can't buy a $10,000 policy and put $1 million into it, because that's not insurance anymore. That's just an investment. So you have to buy the right amount of insurance to make this work. And that really just depends on your personal situation. Again, talk to a professional. But who would ever go to an ATM and just take out $250 if the ATM is charging you $250? You want to take out more than what it's going to charge you. You want to take out the hundreds that you need to make that $250 worth it. Another way to see it, no one pays the cost of going to buffet and then just eats a small snack. If you're going to buffet, the economic thing to do is gorge yourself. Eat as much as possible. Same idea with one of these policies. You have to put as much cash as you possibly can into it without putting too much in to the point of it no longer being an insurance policy. Different way of saying it, you buy a flat rate package. You never buy the biggest box to send the smallest package. You buy a box and then you stuff it full. Same idea here. Let's buy a policy. Let's stuff it full. When it's properly structured, costs are very similar over time to other investments. A huge objection to cash flow insurance is typically the cost, especially because a lot of the cost happens in the first year or two. And so it feels like it takes a lot of runway, a lot of gas to get off the runway. But over time, and this is a permanent insurance policy that's meant to be in place until the day you die. And if it's not, it will have tax ramifications. It's the sort of thing that has to be done right. But over time, that objection really becomes negligible because the costs are very similar. Factor in the tax benefits of this over other investment vehicles that are taxable, and it's significantly more favorable. I don't have time here today to be able to get into the math on that, but let's talk about tax-free loans. Ultimately, the insurance company has a general fund. You have your policy within that company as well. What you do is you take a loan from the insurance company. They're not giving you your money, they're giving you their money, and then they hold your policy as collateral. Because it's a loan, they charge you an interest rate, but you can pay that back on your terms, meaning over time, or not pay it back even. From there, your cash growth, because you haven't taken any of your policy out, your cash growth remains intact. The loan is collateralized by the fact that the insurance policy is still within the company. From there, because your whole policy is still in place, it's still growing at full speed. It's still gaining all the interest it should have gained. If it's not repaid before death, if there is an outstanding loan, then it's just deducted from your death benefit. But it's a great way to be able to access your money. Loans are never taxed, period. So again, proper structuring is key. We're pretty much out of time here. If this is done right, it'll provide a death benefit, provide tax-free retirement benefits. If not, it will either not grow sufficiently because there's not enough cash helping it grow, or it'll create taxable events, or both. And you don't want that. Insist on working with a competent professional. For more information, this book, The Power of Zero by David McKnight, I have studied this book. I've played with others who have similar books and similar concepts, but his gives the math in the easiest way to digest it. Get this book, read it, let's talk. Whatever planning you've already got in place, this is critical. If you're taxable in retirement, it's going to eat up more than you think. Talk about your situation. You want to sit down and discuss things, private message me on Facebook, text me. My number's here on the screen. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. I wish I had time to say, hey, let's have all sorts of question and answers here. But like I said, reach out to me privately and let's talk. Thanks for being here.